They're there, silent and unsettling. Ancient maps that depict a massive land called Tartary, stretching across regions larger than entire continents we recognize today. How is that possible? Was it just a cartographic mistake? Or is there something deeper hidden within the forgotten lines of history? What do these maps truly reveal, and why does it seem like this information faded over time? Get ready to question everything you thought you knew. Imagine opening a centuries-old map and, instead of the familiar borders we know today, you're faced with vast, undefined expanses labeled with a single imposing name: Tartary. It wasn't a country in the way we understand nations now. It appeared more like a sweeping designation, one that covered enormous portions of Asia, from the Caspian Sea all the way to the Pacific Ocean, sometimes even bleeding into parts of Eastern Europe. To modern eyes, it feels exaggerated, almost unbelievable. But to the cartographers of the past, it was a practical way to describe lands that were still largely unknown to them. Back then, map-making wasn't just about accuracy, it was about interpretation. Explorers brought back fragmented accounts, often secondhand, filled with myths, cultural misunderstandings, and limited geographic knowledge. Cartographers had to fill in the blanks, and when faced with vast territories inhabited by diverse nomadic groups, they often grouped them under a single label. Tartary became a kind of umbrella term, used by Europeans to describe a wide and loosely understood region populated by various peoples, including the Mongols, Turkic tribes, and others. But here's where it gets more intriguing. The name itself carries weight. Some believe Tartary was influenced by the word Tartarus, a deep abyss from Greek mythology, reflecting how mysterious and distant these lands seemed to Western civilizations. Others trace it to the Tatars, a real group of people who played a significant role in Eurasian history, especially during and after the Mongol Empire. Over time, the term expanded beyond its original meaning, becoming a catch-all for territories that Europeans didn't fully comprehend. As map-making techniques improved and exploration expanded, the need for such broad labels began to disappear. The once vast Tartary started to fragment on maps, replaced by more precise names: Siberia, Central Asia, Mongolia, and others. Borders became clearer, political entities more defined. What once appeared as a single massive landmass was revealed to be a complex mosaic of cultures, landscapes, and histories. So why do these old maps feel so mysterious today? Part of it is the sheer scale. Seeing a name stretch across such an enormous area triggers our curiosity. It feels like something significant must have been lost or hidden. But in reality, it often reflects the limitations of knowledge at the time, rather than a forgotten super-civilization. Still, the idea continues to spark debate and speculation. Some modern interpretations suggest that Tartary was more than just a label, that it represented a powerful, unified civilization that was somehow erased from mainstream history. These theories gain traction, partly because the maps themselves are real, and their visual impact is undeniable. However, historians generally agree that there's no solid evidence supporting the existence of a single empire matching the scale depicted under the name Tartary. Instead, what we're seeing is a snapshot of how people once understood the world. A reminder that maps are not just geographical tools. They are reflections of perception, knowledge, and sometimes even imagination. And in the case of Tartary, they reveal just how much of the world was once shrouded in mystery. And maybe that's the real fascination. Not a hidden empire, but the realization that our understanding of the world has always been evolving. What seems obvious today was once unknown, mislabeled, or misunderstood. Those massive shapes on old maps aren't necessarily evidence of something lost. They're evidence of a time when the world was still being discovered, piece by piece. And if that much could change over just a few centuries, what else might we still be getting wrong today? Imagine the mindset of a European cartographer in the 16th or 17th century. Information didn't flow instantly. There were no satellites, no global positioning systems, only scattered reports from travelers, merchants, and explorers who often never even crossed the full extent of the lands they described. A single story could influence how thousands of kilometers were represented on a map. When those accounts mentioned vast steppe regions inhabited by unfamiliar cultures, it was easier to assign one sweeping name than to attempt precision that simply wasn't possible. And that's exactly what happened with Tartary. It became less of a place and more of a placeholder, a way to label the unknown. But over time, that placeholder took on a life of its own. The larger it appeared on maps, the more it felt like something cohesive, something unified. To modern viewers, it almost suggests the existence of a forgotten superstate, a hidden empire erased from the pages of history. But that perception comes from how our brains interpret visual scale, not necessarily from historical reality. Another key factor lies in how borders were understood, or rather, not understood, at the time. Today, we think of borders as fixed lines, sharply defining where one nation ends and another begins. But for much of history, especially across Central Asia and Siberia, borders were fluid or even non-existent in the way we imagine them. Nomadic groups moved freely across enormous distances. Empires rose and fell without clearly mapped edges, and influence often mattered more than territory. When European mapmakers tried to capture this complexity, they often defaulted to simplification. So instead of dozens of shifting groups and territories, they saw one massive, undefined region. And that region became Tartary. There's also the question of language and translation. Many early explorers didn't speak the local languages fluently, and misunderstandings were common. A term used to describe a specific group of people could easily be misinterpreted as referring to an entire region. Over time, these small errors accumulated, reinforcing the idea of Tartary as a singular, enormous land, rather than a collection of diverse cultures. But here's where things start to blur between history and speculation. In recent years, the concept of Tartary has been reinterpreted by alternative theories. Some claim it was a highly advanced global civilization, possessing technology far beyond what mainstream history acknowledges. According to these ideas, Tartary wasn't just misrepresented, it was deliberately erased. Buildings, infrastructure, and even entire cities are sometimes cited as evidence of this lost empire. At first glance, it can seem convincing. After all, the maps exist. The scale is undeniable, and the gaps in historical knowledge from that period leave room for imagination to fill in the blanks. But when examined closely, these theories tend to rely on selective interpretation rather than verifiable evidence. Architectural styles attributed to Tartary, for example, are well documented within known historical contexts. The supposed erasure often aligns with natural changes in naming conventions, political shifts, and the progression of geographic knowledge. What makes these ideas so appealing isn't necessarily their accuracy, it's the mystery they tap into. Humans are naturally drawn to the idea that something big has been hidden from us. It creates a sense of discovery, of uncovering a secret that others have overlooked. And when you combine that with the striking imagery of old maps, it becomes even more compelling. But the reality is often less dramatic and, in a way, more fascinating. The story of Tartary isn't about a lost empire. It's about how knowledge evolves. It's about how humans once tried to make sense of a world that was still largely unexplored. Those massive labels on old maps are not evidence of something erased, but of something unknown. And that raises an interesting thought. If future generations were to look at our current maps, our current understanding of the world, would they see them as accurate? Or would they notice the same kinds of gaps, the same simplifications, the same assumptions that we now recognize in those ancient depictions? Because history doesn't just record what we know, it also quietly reveals what we didn't. And when you begin to see it from that perspective, those old maps start to feel less like puzzles hiding secrets, and more like windows into the human mind at a time when the world was still unfolding. Every oversized label, every vague boundary, every enormous stretch marked as Tartary reflects a moment where certainty simply didn't exist. And instead of leaving empty space, cartographers filled it with meaning. There's something almost psychological about it. Humans are uncomfortable with the unknown. When faced with vast unexplored territories, the instinct isn't to leave them blank. It's to define them, even if that definition is incomplete. Tartary became that definition, a name that brought a sense of order to what would otherwise be an overwhelming expanse of mystery. But over time, as expeditions pushed deeper into Asia, as trade routes expanded and empires documented their lands more thoroughly, that illusion of a single unified region began to dissolve. The Russian expansion into Siberia, for example, played a major role in reshaping how these territories were understood. What was once a vague, monolithic space gradually broke apart into mapped rivers, cities, cultures, and political divisions. And with that, the name Tartary slowly faded. Not because something was being hidden, but because something was being clarified. This process happened so gradually that it's almost invisible when you look at history in broad strokes. One map replaces another. One name is swapped for several. One unknown becomes many knowns. But if you compare maps across centuries side by side, the transformation is striking. It's like watching a blurry image come into focus, piece by piece. Still, the ghost of Tartary lingers. It lingers not in official records, but in the questions people continue to ask. Why was it so large? Why was it treated as a single entity? Why does it seem to vanish without explanation? These questions don't come from ignorance. They come from curiosity. And curiosity has a way of pushing us beyond straightforward answers into deeper speculation. In a way, Tartary has become more powerful as an idea now than it ever was as a label on a map. Because today, it represents more than geography. It represents doubt. It represents the possibility that history might not be as complete as we think. And while most of the evidence points toward a simpler explanation, limited knowledge, evolving cartography, shifting language, the emotional pull of a hidden narrative is hard to ignore. But here's the crucial point. Mystery doesn't always mean conspiracy. Sometimes it simply means we're looking at the past through modern eyes, expecting precision from a time that didn't have the tools to provide it. When we see a massive region labeled with a single name, we interpret it as intentional, as if someone deliberately defined it that way. But in reality, it was often the opposite, a lack of detail, a placeholder born out of necessity. And yet that doesn't make it any less fascinating. Because those maps still tell a story, not of a lost empire, but of exploration, of misunderstanding, of cultural distance. They reveal how disconnected different parts of the world once were, and how knowledge had to travel slowly, often distorted along the way. They also remind us that what we accept as truth today is built on layers of interpretation. Just like those cartographers relied on incomplete information, we too rely on systems of knowledge that are constantly evolving. The difference is, we rarely notice it happening in real time. So maybe the real question isn't whether Tartary was real in the way some theories suggest. Maybe the real question is this: how much of our current understanding will one day look just as incomplete? Because if history has shown us anything, it's that the map is never truly finished. And that idea changes everything. Because once you accept that maps are not perfect representations of reality, but evolving interpretations, you begin to see Tartary not as an anomaly, but as a natural step in humanity's attempt to understand the unknown. Think about it. The people creating those maps weren't trying to deceive anyone. They were working with fragments, stories from traders, partial records from distant empires, and observations from journeys that often covered only a fraction of the territory being described. What they produced wasn't false in their context. It was the best possible version of the world they could assemble at the time. And in that version, Tartary made sense. It represented distance. It represented unfamiliar cultures. It represented the edge of what was known. To someone living in Western Europe centuries ago, these lands were not just geographically far, they were conceptually distant. Entirely different ways of life existed there, beyond the reach of direct experience. So instead of dozens of precise distinctions, one broad label carried the weight of that entire unknown world. But as exploration turned into documentation, and documentation into structured knowledge, the need for that label disappeared. Bit by bit, the unknown was replaced with the specific. Rivers were named, mountain ranges were charted, peoples were identified not as part of a vague whole, but as distinct cultures with their own histories. And with each new detail, Tartary shrank, not physically, but conceptually. until eventually it vanished. Not with a dramatic erasure, not with a deliberate rewriting of history, but with quiet replacement. A name that once filled the gaps was no longer needed once those gaps were filled. And yet, the visual impact of those old maps remains incredibly powerful. Seeing a single word stretched across such a massive portion of the earth creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. It clashes with everything we've learned about modern geography. And that clash invites questions, sometimes reasonable, sometimes speculative, sometimes wildly imaginative. That's where the fascination continues to grow. Because in the absence of clear explanations, the human mind looks for patterns, for hidden meanings, for alternative narratives that feel more complete than the simple answer of, "We didn't know yet." It's almost as if uncertainty itself feels unsatisfying, and we instinctively try to replace it with something more definitive, even if that something isn't supported by evidence. But there's a different way to look at it. Instead of asking whether Tartary was a lost empire, what if we see it as a symbol of transition? A marker of the moment when the world shifted from being largely mysterious to increasingly understood. A reminder of how recent our detailed knowledge of the planet actually is. Because it's easy to forget just how limited global awareness was not that long ago. There were entire regions that existed, in practical terms, as abstractions to those mapping them. And Tartary was one of the largest abstractions ever put onto paper. And maybe that's why it continues to capture attention today. Not because it proves something hidden, but because it reveals something fundamental about us. Our need to define, to categorize, to make sense of what we don't fully understand. Those old maps are not just records of geography, they're records of perception. They show us how humans once saw the world, not just how the world actually was. And when you realize that, the mystery shifts. It's no longer about a forgotten civilization waiting to be rediscovered. It's about the realization that knowledge itself is always incomplete, always in progress. That what seems obvious now was once uncertain, and what seems certain today may one day be questioned. So the next time you see one of those maps, Tartary stretching across vast, undefined lands, don't just ask what it was, ask what it represents. Because in the end, it might not be pointing to something that was lost, but to something we are still learning. And maybe that's the most important takeaway of all. Not the idea of something hidden or erased or waiting to be rediscovered, but the understanding that knowledge is always evolving. That what we see, what we accept as truth, is shaped by the limits of our perspective at any given moment in time. Those ancient maps weren't wrong in the way we often assume. They were incomplete. And in that incompleteness, they reveal something deeply human. The constant effort to make sense of a world that is far bigger, far more complex, than we can ever fully grasp at once. Tartary wasn't a forgotten superpower. It was a reflection of uncertainty. A name given to the unknown, stretched across lands that had yet to be clearly understood. And as knowledge expanded, as the unknown became known, that name simply faded into history, quietly, almost invisibly. But the feeling it leaves behind, that curiosity, that sense that there's always more beneath the surface, that never really disappears. Because even today, with all our technology, all our maps, all our data, we are still, in many ways, filling in the blanks. So maybe the real mystery isn't about the past. Maybe it's about how we choose to interpret it. If this made you see history from a new perspective, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment sharing what you think. Was Tartary just a label for the unknown? Or do you believe there's more to the story?